They fined me for hunting on land my grandfather left me, land I protected for decades. So I bought their favorite hiking trail and put up a sign, private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Now the HOA hikes nowhere. Ever since he was a boy, he had walked those woods with his grandfather. The land stretched over 50 acres of dense trees, rolling hills and quiet creeks, tucked just outside a rapidly expanding suburban development. It wasn't much to the average outsider, but to him, it was sacred ground. Land his grandfather had bought decades ago when nobody wanted it. Back then, it had been rugged, wild, and untouched. Now, as shopping centers, gated communities, and asphalt roads crept ever closer, his land stood like a final outpost of nature, defiantly preserved. When his grandfather passed, he didn't leave behind a fortune. There were no stocks, no houses, no pensions. What he left behind was something far more valuable, the deed to that woodland and the wisdom to cherish it. It was the same place where he'd learned how to track deer without disturbing the soil, how to move silently between trees, how to clean his kills with respect, and how to leave no trace but footprints. For him, hunting was never about bloodlust. It was a solemn practice, a connection to something primal, something older than laws and property lines. The land sat just beyond the boundaries of a sprawling suburban HOA known as Willow Creek Estates. Years ago, the woods had been so remote that no one paid attention to them. But times had changed. As property developers cleared out forests and paved over ponds, Willow Creek grew closer and closer. Fancy new homes popped up one by one. Cookie-cutter designs with shiny SUVs in the driveways, little white fences, and lawn gnomes. They brought with them new residents who sipped almond milk lattes, walked poodles in matching sweaters, and whispered loudly about property values. At first, he didn't mind. They stayed on their side of the tree line, and he stayed on his. Sometimes he'd see kids exploring the edges, building forts out of fallen limbs. Sometimes older couples would hike the firebreak trails that crossed between his land and the bordering private lot next to it. None of it bothered him. As long as no one littered or disrespected the land, he turned a blind eye. His grandfather had always believed in sharing the woods with those who appreciated it. But the new HOA had a different idea. They didn't just want order within their walls. They wanted to control everything they could see. At first, it was small things. A note appeared in his mailbox asking if he could kindly refrain from hanging game to dry near the tree line, as it may upset neighborhood children. Then someone complained about the sound of a bowstring being loosed at dawn. A woman jogged past the boundary and posted on social media that she felt unsafe knowing someone was hunting nearby. He didn't even use a firearm, just additional archery, but fear doesn't always follow facts. He shrugged it off. People complain about anything these days. But then came the certified letter. It arrived on a Thursday, stamped with official-looking logos and filled with passive-aggressive language. The Homeowners Association of Willow Creek Estates was fining him $500 for unauthorized use of land adjacent to community space, leading to community safety concerns. They cited reckless behavior involving hunting practices within audible distance of pedestrian trails. It was absurd. His land was not part of their HOA. He had never signed any agreement with them. Yet here they were, sending threats as if he were one of their dues-paying members. Worse, they had the nerve to accuse him of endangering their residents, on land that had been his family's long, before any of them ever planted a garden. The fine was a warning shot, but it cut deeper than they realized. It wasn't about the money. It was about respect. They weren't just criticizing his lifestyle. They were trying to erase it. To people like them, the woods were just a backdrop for Instagram photos. They didn't understand what it meant to live off the land, to respect it, to belong to it. He wasn't the kind of man to storm into meetings or shout into cameras. No, he believed in quiet, deliberate action. If they thought they could push him out, they were wrong. If they thought they could intimidate him with bureaucratic threats, they had no idea who they were dealing with. This land was his legacy, his sanctuary. And if they wanted a war, they'd soon realize they picked the wrong man to provoke. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The HOA of Willow Creek Estates had a reputation, and not a good one. From the very beginning, it operated more like a mini-government than a community organization. Rules were their gospel and enforcement was their weapon. Lawn height, mailbox color, holiday decorations, even the type of birdseed used. Everything had to conform. Most homeowners complied, either out of fear or exhaustion. But this time, the HOA had stepped outside its jurisdiction. They had crossed a line not just geographically, but morally. Word of the hunting fine traveled fast within the community. Some neighbors were appalled, but most remained silent. A few sympathetic residents whispered apologies when they saw him in town, but none stood up to the board. The HOA president, a woman named Charlene Whitmore, had built her authority on fear and micromanagement. A former corporate compliance officer with a talent for manipulation, she viewed the HOA as her personal fiefdom. Under her leadership, even mild dissent was treated as insubordination. Charlene was also fiercely anti-hunting. In her words, the only thing that belongs in the woods is peace. To her, bow hunting, even on private land, was barbaric. She'd once lobbied the county to ban hunting within 5 miles of any residential property, though her petition failed. That defeat only hardened her resolve. Now, with suburban development creeping to the edge of the forest, she saw her chance to assert control where she legally had none. The $500 fine wasn't about safety. It was about power. After the fine, more letters followed. They were carefully worded to avoid direct legal confrontation, but they dripped with thinly veiled threats. One claimed that the presence of wildlife attractants and weapons near HOA property violated community expectations. Another warned of potential civil liability in the event of perceived danger or injury. Despite the fact that he lived entirely outside their neighborhood and governed his own land, the HOA insisted that his proximity to shared use areas gave them a say. He responded to none of it. Responding would be an acknowledgement. He knew their tactics. Intimidate, pressure, wait for compliance. But what Charlene didn't understand was that this land wasn't managed by policy. It was managed by principle. For generations, it had been free and untouched, and no paperwork, letterhead, or legal trickery could erase that. Yet the pressure campaign escalated. The HOA installed new trail markers on the community side of the woods, some of which were suspiciously close to his property. Then came the warning signs. Caution, wildlife hazard zone, no hunting beyond this point, and community watch in effect. All of them placed on trees they didn't own. A lesser man might have argued. A weaker man might have folded. But he wasn't either of those things. Behind the scenes, Charlene was quietly rallying support. She told residents she was working to protect their children, framing him as a rogue woodsman armed with deadly weapons. She made wild claims about hearing arrows whistling past joggers, even though no evidence supported that. It didn't matter. Fear was enough to mobilize the compliant. Soon, she had the full HOA board support, and a growing number of homeowners convinced something had to be done. A town hall meeting was scheduled, under the pretense of public safety discussion. The agenda item was vague, but everyone knew what it was about. Though he didn't attend, the meeting made one thing clear. The HOA wasn't going to stop. Charlene had turned her sights on him and the land he called home. With enough signatures, enough public outcry, and the right legal pressure, she believed she could push him into a corner. But what she failed to realize was that while she was maneuvering through bureaucracy, he was quietly gathering his own information. He started to study the area more closely, walking property lines, marking the boundaries, and documenting every trail that crossed into or out of his land. He noted every spot where the HOA's new trail signs encroached. He took photos, drew maps, and recorded timestamps. This wasn't paranoia. This was preparation. In the process, he began to observe patterns, particularly around one specific trail that ran along the southern edge of the forest. It was heavily used, especially on weekends. Groups of hikers, couples with dogs, mothers with strollers. They always entered to the same access point, a narrow path that snaked in from the HOA neighborhood, across a parcel of private land not owned by the association. He did some research and discovered that the parcel in question wasn't HOA property at all. It belonged to an elderly couple who had lived there long before the development was built. That land was still privately owned, and its boundaries led directly into a series of old fire trails that crossed into his property. It was the secret artery of the HOA's outdoor life, and it was completely unprotected. It was in that moment that the seed of an idea took root. Charlene and her HOA wanted control? Then they should learn what it felt like to lose it. The land they relied on wasn't theirs, and the very path they used to walk their dogs, take selfies, and host guided nature tours was up for sale. They just didn't know it yet. The fine was only the beginning. It marked the point where simmering tension transformed into a deliberate campaign of pressure. What began as passive disapproval from the HOA evolved quickly into an organized attempt to dominate the space beyond their jurisdiction. For years, the land he owned had been respected, even admired by locals. But now, a new class of residents, people who believed order meant ownership, had begun to encroach both physically and politically. The Homeowners Association, though technically confined to its own development, began behaving as if their reach extended every tree they could see from their backyard. After issuing the unauthorized fine, they followed it up with a string of bureaucratic moves, hoping to intimidate or exhaust them into submission. Letters began arriving more frequently, worded in the vague language of legal gray areas, warnings about community safety, allegations of disturbing the peace, and insinuations that local authorities might need to be contacted in the interest of public welfare. None of these messages had any real legal standing, but the sheer frequency with which they appeared told a different story. The HOA was laying the groundwork for something larger. Their strategy was to wear him down through repetition, to cast doubt among neighbors, and to shift public perception against him by painting a distorted picture of danger and lawlessness just beyond the boundary fence. The campaign wasn't just administrative, it was social. Local message board began to fill with comments from concerned residents, most echoing the same phrases: wild activity in the woods, unregulated hunting, possible threat to children. The tone was always speculative, never direct enough to be called slander, but sharp enough to create unease. These posts weren't spontaneous. They were part of a coordinated effort, likely orchestrated by a small group within the HOA leadership who were determined to bring his independent way of life under their control. At the center of this movement was the HOA president, a woman whose name appeared on every letter and notice, Charlene Whitmore. Her presence loomed larger than just her title. She had transformed the HOA into an engine of conformity, pushing aesthetic guidelines with religious fervor and treating deviation as personal defiance. To Charlene, control was synonymous with safety and unpredictability, especially the kind that involved camouflage and bows, was an unacceptable threat to the sanitized world she envisioned. Charlene had long-standing objections to hunting. She spoke frequently about conservation, but framed it through the lens of suburban convenience, not ecological understanding. To her, wildlife was to be appreciated from a distance, on guided tours or in filtered photos, not encountered as part of a living ecosystem with its own rules and rhythms. The idea that someone would hunt ethically and legally for food, out of tradition or principle, was incomprehensible to her curated worldview. She believed people like him didn't belong near her community. The hypocrisy ran deep. While Charlene condemned hunting, she and other HOA members frequently used hiking trails that weren't legally part of their development. These trails wove through neighboring parcels of land that remained privately owned, including one parcel that linked directly to the trail network that crosses property. Despite having no rights to that land, they acted as if it were part of their backyard amenity, clearing brush, marking trees, even installing benches and unofficial signs without permission. In their minds, the land was already theirs. They had walked it for years, introduced it to new residents as a hidden gem, and used it to boost property values in real estate listings. No one had stopped them before, so they treated it as public space. But legally, it wasn't. The parcel that served as the entry point to the trail system belonged to an elderly couple, reclusive and aging, who no longer used it and had no ties to the HOA. That land was unprotected and on the brink of transition. The HOA may have forgotten that. He hadn't. The situation revealed a paradox. The same HOA that accused him of threatening community safety was trespassing on land they had no right to use. They policed his lawful actions on his property, while simultaneously ignoring their own illegal ones. Their authority was based on perception, not legality. And as long as they controlled the narrative, they could keep expanding that authority into areas that were never theirs to begin with. He didn't need to confront them directly to change the game. What he needed was leverage. Something undeniable, something legal, and something final. The answer wasn't in arguing back or filing complaints. It was in acquiring the very thing they depended on, the land they used without permission, the space that made them feel powerful. Their entire illusion of control rested on borrowed ground. And borrowed ground could be bought. The moment the fine arrived, the transformation in strategy began. What was once tolerance had now become focused resolve. The harassment from the HOA was no longer just a nuisance. It was a declaration. But he understood that brute resistance wasn't the answer. In matters like this, victory didn't come from yelling louder. It came from understanding leverage, timing, and the law. The HOA operated on paper threats and public perception. Their power was built on illusion and the assumption that no one would challenge their control. That illusion was about to unravel. He began by reviewing the deed to his own property. It was airtight. The boundaries were well documented, recorded decades ago when his grandfather bought the land. There were no easements, no shared access, no clauses that could be exploited. It was sovereign, private, and free from HOA jurisdiction. But this was just the beginning. The fine had forced him to pay closer attention to everything around him. The maps, the topography, the invisible ways land connected people who otherwise lived separately. The trail system was the key. The HOA's residents regularly hiked through trails that snaked in and out of private parcels not owned by them. Most notably, the Southern Access Trail, the one most frequently used, didn't belong to the community at all. It crossed over a narrow piece of woodland that, according to county records, was still privately owned by a couple whose names hadn't appeared on any community mailing lists or tax-sharing agreements. A deeper investigation revealed that the property had recently been listed quietly, with an aging owner seeking to downsize and relocate to be closer to family. The parcel was up for sale, unadvertised, unknown to the HOA, and priced to move quickly. It was an opportunity few would recognize, and even fewer would act on. But for him, it was perfect. The property was modest in size, but crucial in location. That one piece of land served as the unofficial gateway to the trails the HOA members cherished. Without it, their access would be severed. It was a pressure point, a strategic bottleneck through which their illusion of ownership passed. By acquiring it, he wouldn't just block their access. He'd expose the hollowness of their claims. He contacted the property owner quietly, keeping everything discreet and off the radar. There were no public listings, no open house visits, no bidding wars. Just a respectful offer, slightly above market value, and a promise to maintain the land's dignity. The couple, elderly and weary from years of dealing with the slow encroachment of the HOA, agreed without hesitation. Within weeks, the sale was finalized, recorded at the county office, and legally binding. The land now belonged to him. He didn't announce the purchase. There were no signs, no warnings, at least not immediately. He let things continue as they had. The HOA members hiked, walked their dogs, took photos, hosted group nature walks. They moved through the woods like they always had, never suspecting that the ground beneath their feet had changed ownership. The sense of entitlement ran so deep that none of them considered the possibility that someone else now held the keys to their escape. But while they hiked, he prepared. He hired a local surveyor to confirm the boundaries and mark the perimeter clearly. New fencing materials were delivered discreetly and stored until needed. He reviewed state trespassing laws, consulted with a land rights attorney, and filed the updated property status with a local sheriff's office to ensure enforcement would be swift and unquestionable. Every step was taken deliberately, legally, and without a single warning to those who continue to believe they own the forest through proximity. The irony was sharp. The very people who had fined him for hunting on land he legally inherited were now unknowingly trespassing on land he now legally owned. Their moral high ground had collapsed. They had built their complaints on the assumption that they held power over him, that their community rules and collective outrage could override private rights. But that assumption had always been flawed. Ownership wasn't a matter of group opinion or how many people felt entitled to something. Ownership was about title, law, and action. By the time the final boundary markers were placed and the survey documents submitted to the county, the trap was already set. He didn't need to confront anyone. The land would speak for itself. When the time was right, when everything was ready, the illusion would break, and the HOA would finally understand that the game they were playing had consequences far beyond their narrow vision of order and control. The plan required patience, but it was no longer a theory. The land was his. The law was on his side, and the trail that served as their favorite retreat was now closed permanently. Ownership of the key trail parcel changed everything, even if no one realized it yet. The land, once a forgotten buffer between the HOA development and deeper woods, now sat in his name, fully registered and legally protected. But this wasn't just a property transaction. It was a foundation of a quiet power shift. The HOA still moved as if nothing had changed, blind to the trap that had already closed around them. For years, they had walked through land they didn't own, never questioning access, never suspecting their routines depended on unspoken tolerance. That tolerance had expired. From that moment on, he observed how deeply the HOA depended on that trail. It wasn't just a path through the woods. It was part of their identity. Real estate agents sold homes in the neighborhood using it as a selling point. Easy access to serene hiking trails. Fitness groups met at the trailhead every Saturday morning. Dog walkers treated it like a leash-free paradise. Even HOA board members had started hosting community nature walks for newcomers, acting as if they were offering a private amenity. But none of it was theirs. Every footstep taken across that narrow piece of woodland, now across a legal boundary they didn't know existed. The hypocrisy grew sharper each day. The same board that claimed he endangered the community now trespassed across his land without consent. They who demanded order, compliance, and obedience to their rules now ignored the very concept of private property. They had justified the fine on vague notions of safety. They had labeled him a threat, yet they felt entitled to walk freely across property they had no legal right to enter. There were no signs warning them off yet. But that was intentional. The longer they walked in ignorance, the more powerful the moment of truth would become. He documented everything. Photos, dates, group sizes, and individuals who routinely cross a line. A web of evidence grew. Undeniable proof that the HOA's leadership and residents treated private property like public land, oblivious to the consequences. Each week brought new opportunities to observe. Organize events, unsanctioned tree trimming, trail maintenance with unauthorized tools, all recorded without interference. Their confidence was their downfall. They believed control was permanent, that no one could challenge them, but they had failed to consider the one person they underestimated from the beginning. Charlene, the HOA president, remained the driving force behind the aggression. Her campaign against hunting had not slowed. If anything, it had escalated. She circulated petitions demanding new city ordinances restricting hunting within audible distance of residential zones. She sent emails to county officials accusing him of creating a hostile environment. She even suggested a public forum on community forest safety, hoping to sway public perception even further. But while she waged her war in words and petitions, she failed to see what was happening beneath her feet. Her position depended on authority, the illusion that she could enforce order beyond her legal reach. But that illusion was built on shaky ground. Her favorite walking trail, the one she used to guide HOA guests and impress new buyers, now stood on land she no longer had access to. The moment that truth came to light, her credibility would collapse. Her rules, her warnings, her moral high ground, all would fall apart once the community learned that she, too, had trespassed. The timeline had to be precise. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about strategy. He waited until the deed had been on record long enough for any dispute to be invalid. He allowed the trespasses to continue until they formed a pattern, not just an incident. He consulted legal professionals to ensure every action he planned would stand in court if challenged. When the day of enforcement came, it had to be final. No room for negotiation, no loopholes to exploit. The law had to speak clearly without hesitation. The next step was to change the physical landscape. No longer content with quiet ownership, he began preparations to close access permanently. Boundary surveys were made public and filed with the county's online system. Plans were submitted for installing fencing, gate posts, and cameras. The permits were obtained legally and transparently. Every step was taken with meticulous care. There would be no room for accusation or reversal. When the community was finally made aware of the change, it would be undeniable and irreversible. The anticipation built like pressure behind a dam. The HOA walked, talked, and issued threats from behind their imaginary shield of authority, unaware that the real balance of power had already shifted. They had tried to force compliance through fear and policy, but compliance was never on the table. They had awakened someone who understood land not as a commodity, but as a legacy, and they had mistaken patience for weakness. Their favorite trail was now a countdown. Every step they took brought them closer to the moment when their illusion would shatter. And when it did, there would be no appeal, no community vote, no petition strong enough to undo the consequences of their arrogance. The preparation for closure unfolded in quiet, deliberate stages. The days of observation were over. Now came the execution, calculated, lawful, and unrelenting. He wasn't seeking attention, nor did he care for confrontation. His aim was simple, to enforce the same standards the HOA had tried to impose on him. But unlike their tactics of overreach and passive threats, his methods were rooted in legality and precision. Every action was documented, every permit secured, every boundary confirmed by certified professionals. There would be no ambiguity, no debate, only consequence. The land now bore visible changes. Where once there was an open path, stakes marked the perimeter with reflective tape. Wooden posts were driven into the soil, each one lining the legal property line, verified by a licensed surveyor. Bright orange signs began to appear. Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Each one installed with GPS coordinates filed with the county. It was no longer possible for anyone to claim ignorance. The message was clear. Access was no longer granted. Cameras went up next, mounted on trees and weatherproof casings, aimed at key crossing points along the trail system. They weren't hidden. That wasn't the purpose. Their visibility was intentional, a silent warning that someone was watching, and that unauthorized use of the land now carried consequences. The footage fed directly to a cloud-based archive, time-stamped and securely stored. Every hiker, jogger, dog walker, and board member who stepped onto property was now recorded. There will be no excuses. The local sheriff's department was notified of the new ownership and the plan to enforce trespassing laws. A formal complaint hadn't been filed yet, but the department now had the property documents on file and had confirmed their support should enforcement be required. No dramatic action was needed. The foundation had already been laid. What remained was for the inevitable confrontation to arise not from aggression, but from inevitability. The HOA would discover what they had ignored for too long. That control without ownership is a fantasy, and assumption without permission is a liability. The changes sparked immediate confusion. Early morning trailgoers stopped at the new signs, unsure whether they applied to them. Some turned back. Others hesitated, then crossed anyway. A few attempted to justify their presence by referencing community maps or claiming long-time use. But it didn't matter. The signs didn't ask for justification. They stated the law. And the law didn't care how long someone had treated private land as public property. Legally, usage without consent was still trespassing. News traveled quickly. Within a week, HOA message boards lit up with questions, complaints, and theories. Residents speculated about whether the county had changed the land status, whether a new developer had acquired the property, or whether someone was trying to shut down their beloved trails out of spite. Most still hadn't connected the dots. The idea that the man they had tried to find had quietly bought the trailhead never occurred to them. Their disbelief was evidence of their arrogance. They had assumed he had no recourse. Now they were discovering that power doesn't always speak loudly. It just moves quietly until it's too late to stop. Charlene, the HOA president, reportedly demanded answers. She contacted the county office, searched property records, and attempted to arrange a meeting with whoever now owned the land. Her requests were ignored. There was no meeting to be had. The time for conversation had passed. She had used bureaucracy as a weapon and now found herself trapped in the very system she had once manipulated. Her credibility began to falter. Residents demanded explanations she couldn't give. Their weekend routines were disrupted, their favorite walking spots fenced off, their illusion of shared space gone in an instant. The community's internal forums, once used for neighborly announcements and lost pet alerts, now brimmed with frustration. Some blamed the HOA for overstepping. Others lashed out at the unknown landowner. Rumors swirled. A few suggested lawsuits. But even they knew such efforts were futile. The ownership records were clean. The signs were lawful. The enforcement, though passive, was airtight. The HOA had built its power on perception, and that perception had collapsed. The greatest blow came not from confrontation, but from silence. There was no letter announcing the closure, no verbal warning, no drawn-out dispute, just a change in the landscape, backed by law and enforced by boundaries. It left no room for negotiation or retaliation. It simply existed, a reality the HOA could neither undo nor ignore. This wasn't just about a trail. It was about the principle of ownership and the cost of arrogance. The HOA had treated private land as a playground, assuming their collective voice could override individual rights. They had forgotten that land remembers its stewards and punishes its intruders. The land was now sealed. The illusion was shattered. The reckoning had only just begun. The closure of the trail marked a shift that rippled far beyond the boundary markers. What had once been a silent agreement, an unspoken allowance for community use, was now a definitive end to access. There was no press release, no public meeting, no explanation offered. The sign spoke clearly. The trail was no longer available. The emotional backlash was swift, but the legal footing remained solid. There was nothing the HOA or its members could do to undo the transaction or challenge the new restrictions. The land was private. The access had been a courtesy. That courtesy was now gone. The community response fractured along predictable lines. Some residents responded with confusion, genuinely surprised that the trail they had used freely for years had never been part of the HOA's holdings. Others reacted with anger, demanding the board take immediate action. But when it became clear that the HOA had no legal claim to the land, those demands turned inward. Accusations flew. People questioned why the board had never secured a formal agreement with the previous owner. Some criticized Charlene directly, claiming her crusade against the hunter had provoked retaliation that now affected everyone. Charlene, once the HOA's unchallenged authority, began to lose her grip. The narrative she worked so hard to craft, that of a community protector standing against an unsafe landowner, began to unravel. Her failure to anticipate the consequences of targeting someone outside their jurisdiction became the central topic in neighborhood conversations. Even her allies grew quiet. The sudden and irreversible loss of access to the trails weakened her credibility and undermined perception of her leadership. Without the trails, the community felt smaller, less free, and less united. The resentment built quickly. Local real estate agents took notice too. The trail system had always been a selling point, something advertised in listings and brochures. Its sudden closure raised questions from prospective buyers. Open house visits turned awkward when potential residents asked about hiking access, only to be met with vague or defensive responses. A few deals fell through entirely. Property values became a point of concern. The amenities that had once justified inflated home prices were now reduced, and it showed. The financial implications were subtle at first, but they hinted at a broader decline in desirability for the neighborhood. The HOA attempted to negotiate a reversal. Informal messages were sent through mutual acquaintances, asking if access could be restored in the interest of community wellness. These gestures were ignored. Eventually, the board issued a formal letter requesting a meeting to discuss coexistence and mutual benefit. It was never acknowledged. The silence was deliberate, and the outcome final. The trail wasn't blocked out of spite. It was closed to restore the balance that had been disrupted by arrogance and overreach. The land had never belonged to the community, and the assumption that it did had always been a mistake. In the weeks following the shutdown, the trailhead grew quiet. The sound of laughter, footsteps, and casual conversation gave way to the rustling of wind through untouched leaves. The ground, once worn smooth by constant use, began to recover. Grass returned. Saplings rose where once they were trampled. Wildlife, once kept at a distance by frequent human presence, returned to their natural rhythms. The land began to heal, not just physically, but symbolically. It no longer served as a convenience for others. It had reclaimed its solitude. What had started as an HOA campaign to impose control had ended in total exclusion. The very trail that had once represented openness and recreation now stood as a boundary, a reminder that not all land is up for negotiation. The contrast was stark. Where the HOA operated through rules and procedures designed to standardize and assimilate, the landowner had acted with quiet precision, enforcing the one rule that mattered most: respect ownership or lose access. Internally, the HOA board scrambled to manage the fallout. Charlene's leadership was challenged in a vote that narrowly failed, though her influence was clearly diminished. Residents demanded reforms, including transparency around property claims and limits to the HOA's reach. Committees were formed to explore alternative recreational opportunities, but nothing could replace what was lost. The trail had been central to the community's lifestyle, and its absence created a void that could not be filled with artificial replacements. The board tried to pivot, reframing the situation as a temporary setback or an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the residents were no longer convinced. They had seen how quickly things could change when assumptions went unchecked and when power was exercised without consideration for consequences. The land had become more than property. It was now a symbol of limits, a line that could not be crossed, no matter how many homeowners signed petition or voiced outrage. The path was gone, and with it, the illusion of control. What remained was a sound of silence where footsteps used to echo, and a lesson the HOA would not soon forget. The fallout from the trail closure extended beyond the boundaries of the land itself. What had begun as a neighborhood disturbance was now a quiet but powerful reckoning, not only for the HOA board but for the collective psyche of the entire community. People who once walked freely without thought now questioned what else they had assumed belonged to them. The illusion of entitlement had been punctured, and the consequences could no longer be ignored. It was no longer just about access to a path. It had become about identity, control, and fragility of imagined authority. Tensions rose steadily within the neighborhood. Charlene's position on the board remained intact, but her grip on influence was slipping away. Residents who had once championed her decisiveness now whispered about her short-sightedness. Meetings that were once orderly and dominated by her voice became contentious, filled with questions she could not answer and frustration she could not deflect. The confidence she had wielded so easily began to crack under the weight of the fallout. Every attempt to redirect blame or reframe the situation only reminded homeowners of the cause and effect chain she had initiated. The board's unity fractured. Some members, previously passive, began pushing back on Charlene's leadership, questioning how far the HOA's ambitions should extend and whether their actions had overstepped ethical boundaries. A few openly admitted the hunting fine had been a mistake, a provocation that had turned a neutral party into a determined adversary. These internal divisions weakened the board's ability to function, paralyzing decision-making and eroding trust among homeowners who were desperate for leadership during a time of community-wide uncertainty. Outsiders took notice as well. The neighborhood, once praised for its well-kept trails and peaceful lifestyle, began to draw less flattering attention. Local blogs picked up the story of the trail closure, framing it as an example of suburban overreach clashing with rural independence. The comments on those articles painted a picture of a community that had lost its way, prioritizing petty control over cooperation, micromanagement over mutual respect. The story became a quiet, cautionary tale, one that reached well beyond county lines. Residents grew more vocal in their criticism. Community forums, once a place for event announcements and lighthearted banter, now hosted long threads dissecting the board's decisions. New homeowners expressed concern that they had been misled about amenities. Longtime residents lamented the loss of the trail as a gathering point, a place where they had once bonded with neighbors, watched their children play, or walked their dogs in peaceful routine. A shared space had become a symbol of exclusion, and there was no consensus on how to fix it. Some residents proposed fundraising to purchase access rights from a new landowner, imagining that money might reopen the gates. Others floated legal theories, hoping to uncover a loophole that would restore what had been lost. But none of these ideas gained traction. The legal path was closed. The trail was private, and the message had been clear. This was not a negotiation. It was a boundary reasserted by action. The time for compromise had long since passed, buried under the weight of prior disrespect. What few understood, even now, was that the closure had not been reactive. It had been planned, step by step, in response to years of escalating intrusion. It had not been emotional. It had been inevitable. The community had relied on unspoken permission, and then mistaken it for a right. When that illusion was challenged, their response had not been humility, but entitlement. And in the end, that arrogance had cost them far more than a walking path. It had cost them trust, credibility, and a part of the freedom they had taken for granted. The psychological impact lingered. Even those who hadn't used the trail regularly felt the change. The forest, once a place of openness and ease, now stood as a quiet reminder of conflict. The border was clear, the message unmistakable. Property, once respected, must be respected again. The fence was not just a physical barrier. It was a mirror held up to the community's behavior, reflecting back the consequences of assuming too much and apologizing too late. Attempts to move on proved difficult. Even new projects and amenities within the HOA's control failed to replace what had been lost. Green spaces were not the same as trails through living woods. Benches on sidewalks could not replicate the serenity of natural canopies. The community's lifestyle, once centered around easy access to nature, now felt confined and artificial. And no matter how the board spun the narrative, the homeowners knew the truth, that their own overreach had brought about the change. The silence from the landowner remained constant. There were no statements, no arguments, no reversals. The gate remained closed. The signs remained posted. The cameras remained fixed. And with every passing day, the reality set deeper into the collective memory of the neighborhood. Some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Time moved on, but the effects of the trail closure never truly faded. Seasons changed, new residents arrived, and old ones moved away. But the story of what happened lingered like a quiet echo across the neighborhood. It became a subtle part of local lore, not always spoken aloud, but understood. The once vibrant trails remained closed, reclaimed by nature, growing thicker and more private with every passing month. What had been taken for granted was now gone, not through force, but through a reassertion of boundaries that should never have been challenged. Within the HOA, reforms were quietly adopted. The board began to limit the scope of its actions, avoiding the aggressive postures it once embraced. Meetings took on a different tone, less about authority and more about consensus. Charlene eventually stepped down, not through scandal or removal, but through quiet resignation. Her departure marked the end of an era, and her name became a symbol not just of control, but of what happens when ambition overrides humility. The community, now more cautious and reflective, made efforts to restore internal harmony. Events once centered around the forest trails shifted to local parks and common areas. New leadership emphasized respect for boundaries, not just physical ones, but social and ethical ones. Homeowners learned to ask more questions, read more closely, and assume less. The culture of assumed entitlement gave way to one of careful stewardship. Meanwhile, the land remained as it had been, unchanged, untouched, and at peace. It required no announcements, no confrontation, no reminders of its presence. Its silence was its statement. It had never asked for recognition or validation. All it demanded was respect. And through its closure, it had finally received it. Where there had once been noise, traffic, and disregard, there was now quiet. The balance had been restored. The lesson endured. Ownership was not just about possession, but about principle. Control without consent was temporary. Assumption without respect was dangerous. The land did not need fences to defend itself. It needed only someone willing to stand for it, not through conflict, but through conviction. And when that conviction met arrogance, it did not shout, it simply acted. In the end, the trail that had once symbolized community became something far greater. It became a quiet monument to the idea that not everything is for everyone, that some things, especially those handed down through generations, are sacred, and when disrespected, they will find a way to speak, through closure, through silence, through unshakable ownership. If you believe in standing up for what's yours and holding the line against arrogance and entitlement, then share this story. Let it be a reminder that respect for boundaries isn't optional. It's essential. Subscribe for more real stories of justice and quiet revenge. And remember, never mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes, the strongest message is the one delivered without a single word.